Good morning. My name is Diana Jameson, and I am your service leader today. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock. Whether you are a longtime member, a first-time visitor, or a returning friend, we are glad that you are here. This is a place where we gather to seek truth, nurture compassion, and encourage one another in the work of living fully and loving generously. May this time together bring you peace, inspiration, and connection. Run out. We light our chalice this morning as a symbol of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. May it remind us that even in the midst of history's struggles between crown and church, or between power and spirit, there is always a flame within us that cannot be extinguished. Between the sacred and the secular, between crown and cathedral, people have long sought to balance power and spirit. This morning we gather not to take sides, but to reflect on ancient questions that are still with us. How do we live together? Where does wisdom reside? What happens when power competes and when it cooperates? Here in this circle, we pause, we breathe, we listen, and we remember our highest allegiance is to truth, to love, and to the work of building a better world. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Tom Parrish. Tom is a retired Marine, and these are his words, an amateur historian, and an internationalist with deep academic and personal study in history and world affairs. He holds a BA from Randolph-Macon College, an MA in International Relations from USC, and has studied at the Royal Institute of Foreign Affairs, King's College in London, the London School of Economics, and Virginia Tech. Today he brings us his reflections on the dynamic relationship between the church and the crown, dependence, competition, and the rise of the West. Please join me in welcoming Tom.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jeff for the Gregorian chants that set the stage here. That was perfect. And Diana's reading, although we didn't talk about it, I thought set the stage just perfectly. So that was good. I want to say that we went to I think it's called the Interracial Conversations group. Is that it? Was it Tuesday night? Mm-hmm. And if you were there, you heard Dr. Patrick Harrington talk about a database he set up on slavery in the county. But the one thing he talked about, and he and I talked about it afterwards, is the difficulty of being a historian, and especially an amateur historian. because answering what, where, and when in history itself is not easy. Everybody's going to disagree on exactly what happened, where it happened, where it happened that. We got some case that. Victors write the history and losers rebuff it. Facts are often just extrapolations or suppositions, and when it comes to why, an historian can present any reasonable answer as long as he can justify it. But it becomes only an answer. Unfortunately, a lot of people take it as the. Last year, I spoke on the importance of Christ Calvin's influence on the European capitalist system and the rise of the West. That was an item of importance in the rise of the West. But there are other factors as well. Geography plays an extremely important role. Climate, topography, and a host of other things. One of the discriminators in the West, though, from the other civilizations is that in Europe, you had a church. You had the church. You had the Roman Catholic Church as an institution and an organization responsible for protecting the purity of religion and depending upon the crown for the same civil protection that other institutions and people got, but owing only spiritual approbation and succor to the crown in return. In the 8th to the 13th centuries, the church and the crown hammered out a series of agreements that establishes the cultural responsibilities of each, and that sets the West apart. Before I begin my talk, I want to take this time just to discuss a little terminology. I'm not going to talk about religion. I'm going to talk about the church as an institution. I'm going to disassociate religion. That doesn't minimize the importance of religion, but right now we're talking about a clash of organizations. The church has three main duties and responsibilities. The first one is they need to be the source of orthodoxy and generally accepted belief. 2, they establish rituals and how to conduct them, establish church law, and establish standards of acceptable behavior. And the third one really comes to the crux of what I'm going to talk about today. They establish a hierarchical structure and control appointments to the senior leadership in that structure so that they can accomplish the first two. Since the most important official in the Catholic Church is the Pope, I'm going to use metonymies but for the two. The Church and the Pope will substitute for each other throughout. Don't get lost in that, if you will. Lastly, you're going to get the equivalent of a roller skate tour through the Louvre as I go through the history. So if I leave out anything you think is important, please let me know. If there's anything you disagree with, please let me know. And I hope that I can make this educational and enjoyable. So, by the mid-8th century in Europe, the church and the crown were both beginning to emerge as a power. The crown really became a power under the Merovingians in about the 6th century. And the papacy was just emerging as a power. So they kind of emerged together at this point and kind of relied on each other. Now the situation at the time was Northern Europe was still under the reigns of Odin and the Norse gods. And most of the Arian controversy had been settled. The Arian controversy was, while Constantine settled the idea of the Trinity during the Nicene conference, not everybody agreed, okay? And there were still some who held on to the fact that since God begat Christ, that Christ and God were separate. Those were the Arians. That was beginning to recede. Another threat at the beginning of the 8th century was the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain, which is actually in conflict with the Abbasids in Baghdad, but that's another story. But and had it not been for Charles the Hammer, in 732, the Umayyad Caliph may have been able to make its inroads in Gaul and then on to the rest of Europe. However, at the Battle of Poitiers in 732, the hammer stopped them, saving Christendom, if you will. But herein comes another one of those historical bits of information. How many of you have always heard of that as the Battle of Tours? When I read Poitiers, I said, no, that's a 14th century battle. That was the English did that. Well, remember I said to the victor goes the responsibility, the privilege to write history? The English wrote the history, and they wanted Poitiers to be remembered as their battle, so they changed Poitiers' battle to Tours. That's an aside. In the mid-century, the hammer's son, Pippin the Short, chafing under the facade of being merely the mayor of the palace for the Merovingians. That meant that he was the warlord for the Merovingians. He was responsible for basically the kingdom, and the Merovingian kings were basically just a figurehead. In fact, while he rode ahead on his charger, the Merovingian king rode on the back of an ox cart wherever they went. So, Pippin's kind of chafing with this, and he approaches the Pope and says, look, I'm the real power. Why shouldn't I be the king? And the Pope goes to the good book, and he goes to Samuel, and he sees Samuel basically depose Saul and replaced him, anointed David. He said, yeah, we can do that. So the Pope, he sends Archbishop Boniface to anoint him. A year later, Pope Stephen II makes a trek all the way to visit Pepin personally because he's being attacked by the Lombards in Italy, and his lands are being taken. Now, he takes with him something called the donation of Constantine, which Constantine gave allegedly to Sylvester I, the first pope, that said, you're the Pope of the West, I give you all these lands in Italy. So he took it up there to prove that those were his lands. Unfortunately, it was a forgery. But anyhow, Pepin accepts the responsibility. He goes down, he takes care of the Lombards, he issues his own donation by which he establishes papal lands, which were established through the 19th century. And Sylvester then, excuse me, let me use my place. So in return, Stephen personally anoints him and forbids the Franks to ever elect anyone not of Pippin's Carolingian line. By this act, the church established its value to the crown. Henceforth, Frankish kings and all kings would be considered made only after being anointed and consecrated by a bishop or an archbishop. And anyone who challenged them risked the wrath of God. The crown protected the church, and the church reciprocated in anointing them. But that began some of the conflict. Did God anoint Pepin, or did the church? Therein lay the issue. In 776 CE, entered the father of Europe, Charlemagne the Great. 6'3", red-headed, warrior, took a bath every day. He ruled most of Europe south of the Rhine, to include Italy and bits of Spain. While heretofore the Merovingian and Carolingian crowns had really been just warlords interested in the land for its own personal value and very little in governance. There was no governance. The people happened to be there. They're there to support me. So be it. Charlemagne, however, was different. His constancy of purpose was, and here's where I could use Hanukkah, because it's in Latin, and I won't give you the Latin because I can't pronounce it, but it was restoration of the Roman Empire. Most of the Carolingians and the Merovingians absolutely, they were the nouveau riche. They wanted to be like Romans. So Charlemagne wanted to bring that back. This meant not just restoring the lands, but also civil, legal, economic practices and institutions, which he had to build from the ground up. He understood power and prestige. He established liaison and ambassadors with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and with the Byzantium Emperor in Constantinople. So impressed was the Abbasid Caliphate that he gave him an elephant, which he brought back to Aachen and put in a zoo. Charlemagne's reign is often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. I like to think that maybe forest fire would be a better phrase, because it was brief and it was bright, but the embers went on for centuries and would ignite regularly. He spoke and read Latin, and Augustine's City of God was his favorite book, and that's important because it talks about the city of God on earth, which he sought to recreate. At his court in Aachen, he assembled an extraordinary body of scholars from Ireland, Scotland, England, Italy, Greece, Byzantium, and even from the centers of learning in Spain. The dean of the academy was an Anglo-Saxon monk from Lindisfarne in York, named Alcuin, who was not only the dean of the academy, but he was Charlemagne's close personal advisor and architect of Charlemagne's vision of what the holy city on earth would be. He charged the academy to help establish procedures for civic rule, law, accounting, and supervisory institutions that would become the foundation for crowns throughout the medieval era. He even had if you will, an inspector general corps that traveled throughout his realm, bringing back word of how things were going and also correcting injustices. He was a very forward thinker. He became so venerated by his successors that all of them looked to Charlemagne for an example. Legend has it that Otto, one of the Ottos, I can't remember which one, Otto the First, Second, or Third. That's another problem. When you go through medieval history, are we talking about Henry III from France, England, or was it the Holy Roman Empire? And you better keep them straight. But anyhow, he went down to visit the tomb, and he had the tomb open so he could view Charlemagne. And Charlemagne, legend has it, was sitting there on his crown with a scepter in his hand, crown on his head, and the Bible open to the Gospels. That was how much he was venerated. Charlemagne was a devout Catholic. He really, really was. In 799, the dissident Roman clergy and nobility, resentful of the Frankish influence on the church, captured Pope Leo III and accused him of adultery and corruption. They beat him, tortured him, cut his tongue out and poked out his eyes, and deposed him. Now, Leo escaped and went to Charlemagne, at which point he was completely cured and his tongue was back and his eyes were back. And he begged Charlemagne to please come down and rescue him. So Charlemagne didn't just jump on his charger and ride down there and say, "You're in." He rode down there with the Pope and investigated the situation, found it was without merit, extracted a promise from Leo that he had not done it, and he reinstated him. So the crown protected the church. What did the church do in return? On Christmas Day, 800 current era, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the Roman Emperor. Big ceremony. Now, Roman Emperor, I always thought it was the Holy Roman Emperor. Nope, he wasn't the Holy Roman Emperor. That would come about 1,000 years later. That was an elaborate mass, well attended. All the city of Rome was there. But even prior to the coronation, Charlemagne, and like the Frankish kings before him, like most barbarian kings, saw themselves not only as the civil head, but they were the religious head of the institution. So Charlemagne, looking at the church in late in the 18th century, saw that it was illiterate, ignorant, ineffective, and immoral. I needed the alliteration to add a little spice to this. So, but it was basically true, especially at the priestly level. Who was a priest? Anybody who could step up to the altar. Anybody you could grab to say, okay, did he need to know the dogma? Did he need to be able to read? No. Just stand there and wave. So bad was their Latin that Boniface caught a priest in Germany whose Latin was so bad that he was baptizing in the name of the fatherland, the daughter, and the Holy Spirit. And the Pope approved that. That's okay. It's all right. But Charlemagne sought to fix that, and he put his academy to work on a project he called the Correctio. Let's get this all straight. Let's figure it out. Oh, what have I got here? All right, we're almost in trouble, folks. But anyhow, so what he did was he charged the academy to fix things, and under his leadership, Alcuin established schools and libraries for the clergy, required monasteries and cathedrals to do likewise, developed the foundational education forms that we marginally followed, at least until I graduated from high school. All right? They were called the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Now, grammar wasn't, periods and commas. It was you would learn you would learn to memorize, learn to accept facts, right? From which we get grammar school, right? So the trivium went on beyond that, and that was the normal course of study throughout the Middle Ages. Rituals and administration of the sacraments were standardized by him. Not the least of which he published a calendar of holy days, because there had been none. In fact, there was a big discussion over which day we celebrate that. And that was one of the big splits with the Irish and the English church. When is Easter? And it's still the split between the Orthodox and the Catholic. He established a calendar. He provided written copies of the sacraments out to the clergy, dictated a minimum library that the clergy should hold. And during the 9th century, over 100,000 manuscripts were copied in the Carolingian area of Europe alone. More than that, he issued a series of what he called capitularies, which were basically royal proclamations, covering a number of subjects, from civil to religious to moral. He set out one that set the morals for the priests. Priestly conduct was abysmal in those days. If you were the priest and you got a confession that there was an adulteress, you had a number you could call, So that was a joke. Nobody got it. Yeah, all right, okay. And he even wrote a civil code for family matters. He outlawed divorce. He outlawed polygamy, notwithstanding the fact that he had 5 wives. Incest, and divorce only on the grounds of adultery. And the last one would have been, for parts of America, very difficult, because he defined sanguinity, blood relationship, as going down 7 levels. So you could not marry someone who was less than 7 levels removed from your bloodline. I can think of places where that wouldn't play. But Charlemagne was more OT than Old Testament than New Testament when it came to his foes. He was vengeful and brutal, even if they were Christians. His Saxon Capitulary stands as a blueprint for the comprehensive and ruthless Christianization of a conquered society. It listed 34 punishments for Saxon religious rites, 11 of which were capital offenses, including eating meat during Lent, desecration or theft from churches, conspiring against Christians, cremation of the dead, and the rape of highborn daughters. Highborn daughters, everybody else was fair game. Charlemagne's correctio infringed on the crown. You know, that was what we said, one of the first duties was you set the dogma and you set the basic faith. Well, Charlemagne was clearly doing a lot of that. While that may have chapped the Pope, the thing that got to him was the infringement on the last one, which was appointing the senior officials in the hierarchy. Charlemagne and kings after him felt it's my duty to nominate bishops, archbishops. It's my duty occasionally to rip you out of the papacy and replace you. This was the investiture controversy, which was to bedevil the crown and the church for the next 400 years. The foundation for this feud was two different views of the coronation. In the annals written by Charlemagne's chaplain, it read, "After the Pope put the crown on Charlemagne's head, all the Romans cried out, 'To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Roman life and victory.'" Crowned by God. Ordained by God, he was omnipotent, infallible, unimpeachable, and had the responsibility for taking care of the church. The papal recording said, after he put the crown on, then all the faithful Romans, seeing what a pillar of defense he was, and what love he had for the Holy Roman Church and its vicar, unanimously at the will of God and St. Peter, the doorkeeper of the kingdom of heaven, is anointed the crown. All right? The church anointed him with the authority of God, and it was the church to whom he owed his allegiance. All right? And because I did it, I can judge you and I can punish you if I need be. And I need my officers in charge of my congregants in your fiefdom. The church's perspective held that that they really needed to invest the bishops, because those were the ones who would enforce disciplinary sanctions when called out by the church. What do I mean by that? The church wielded three weapons for discipline, to clergy and laity alike. It was excommunication, also anathema, called anathema, eviction, and deposal of the crown. The first two, excommunication and eviction, would deny access to sacraments. Eviction would specify which sacraments we're going to deny to you. And I've got an example of that. Excommunication, however, denied the sacraments completely. You still had a responsibility to attend Mass, but you were excommunicated. Now, in the 8th century, that would have been devastating, much more so than today. Think about it. That was an era when demons lurked everywhere. Damnation was real, hell was eternal, and you couldn't just walk across the meadow to change with the Unitarian Church. Deposal removed the holy sanction from the crown. He went in and told the barons, "You're absolved of your oaths to the crown. You put the pressure on them, you take them out. I've effectively removed them, it's now your job." To add pressure to the crown, the Pope could and did communicate cities, towns, and whole countries. And I've got an example of that. One of the most famous being was that was a disagreement over the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. The English king fought hard for his nominee, but Pope Innocent excommunicated him and absolved all the barons of their oaths. He also issued an interdict for all of England that lasted for 6 years. No church bells, and the only sacraments that were allowed was baptism and the last confession. So for 6 years, England was without bells, they were without marriages. Now, would all the priests support that? But if the bishops had not supported that, there was no utility in that interdict. So it was important that he got them. This is tied to the Magna Carta, if you look at it, because it was at about the same time that he absolved the barons of their oath to the John, and the barons kind of stepped up and said, let's get together at Runnymede, and we're going to talk about what your job is and mine. John made obeisance. He turned the kingdom over to the Pope and leased it back from him for 1,000 marks a year. And when he did that, the Pope condemned the Magna Carta. Now, so obviously the Crown would like to be able to appoint the bishops. That way they can avoid the pain of the interdiction. The investiture controversy was also, however, about finances. This was an agrarian economy wherein gold and silver were almost non-existent. The Crown had no standing army. Nobles whose loyalty was purchased and rewarded by revenue-producing agricultural lands provided the men at arms. It's very close to feudalism, but feudalism as an institution itself is 300 years in the future. Since Europe was still heavily forested at this time, arable land was scarce, and conquest was the only way to obtain new land with which to ensure a loyal retinue. But that became a do loop. You had to conquer land to give to the nobles, and you had to give them land as a reward for conquering the land, which meant you needed more land to conquer, and it went on and on and on. There was an alternative, and that was church land. Okay, church land was within your domain, you just appropriated it. To give you an idea of how extensive church land was, when Henry VIII abolished the monasteries in 14, whatever it is, he took up about 1/3 of the land of England. He took under his realm, away from the monasteries. So that was good. The other one was, if the position that you needed filled wasn't important enough, or you didn't have land enough, you offered him a sinecure. You gave him a job that paid him for basically doing nothing. One of the most lucrative was being a bishop. So you made him a bishop, that way he could take the church funds and what have you, and you didn't have to give up any precious land. So the church and the crown were on a collision course, and they'd struggle over this for the next 400 years. By and large, the crown was so caught up in palace coups, conquering barbarians, fighting the Vikings, they had no time for the controversy. It just awarded rings and staffs on its own. Well, the church did try to intervene in civil successions, conflicts, and tried to impose conditions on warfare with some success. The peace of God and the treaty of God did do some limit on warfare. And distract warriors by crusades. You got too many knights running around with warring, send them to the Holy Land. Let them go there. The most famous saga of the investiture, however, involved Pope Gregory VII, who was a truly devout crusading monk who sought to end simony in the church, buying church offices, end the immorality of the priests, and settle the controversy over investiture. He was up against Henry IV. Henry IV was a Holy Roman Emperor and had been since then. So Henry was adamant about naming his own people. The Pope said, fine, you're excommunicated. Barons, I absolve you of responsibilities. Henry was not popular anyhow, and his barons said, you're out. The barons couldn't agree on a new crown, however, and they called him back and said, okay, if you'll go down and apologize, we will reinstate you. So this is, I don't know whether anybody's ever heard the term of going to Canosa, which means that you go to get your butt spanked in an embarrassing way. Well, Henry had to cross the Alps in January and stand barefooted in the snow for 3 days outside the castle at Canossa until the Pope said, okay, you're absolved. Didn't do any good because he had to excommunicate him 3 more times, and finally Henry ran the Pope out of Rome, and he died in southern Italy. The issue came to a head in the 12th century. It was settled first in France and England. It's kind of easier to bite off small pieces and solve them. Problem was Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, didn't buy into the solution. So he went and captured the Pope, dragged him out, dictated terms to him and said, this is the way it's going to be. And the Pope said, okay, signed off on it. The Lateran Council didn't buy it, however. So it went back to the drawing board, and then Henry V sat down with Pope Calixtus II and hammered out what was called the Concordat of Worms. Complicated agreement, but basically what it said is, Pope, you can invest the bishops as long as I get approval of who they are. And the other part was that the crown said, okay, I will release my what's called regalia, which was the money and the goods released to the crown, to the papacy, quicker than we had before. Who won? It was kind of a tie, but it was kind of one of these ties with the crown up here and what have you. The church-crown relationship in years beyond was anything but simpatico. We know that. Crowns deposed popes, popes deposed crowns, popes and high church officials were murdered. The church was taken away into exile by the French. But there was agreement on boundaries between the two domains, and tension between them ensured that neither one became all dominant. The conflict was important during the formative years of European culture because it established those boundaries. It forced each one of them to establish their own set of rules, regulations, and institutions. They sometimes assisted each other. Obviously, the crown relied on educated clergy, because that's all there were, for assistance, and they relied on each other. The crown helped provide defense, and the clergy assisted otherwise. So, no one power came to dominate the other. The church and the crown were separated, and we march into European West. So, what about the Reformation? That's another story. Any questions?
That they needed the imprimatur of the Pope because they genuinely feared excommunication or one of these lesser sanctions. So that depends on this perception of the power of the Pope. But I know Reformation is another story, but when you get into Reformation and Martin Luther says, no, you people can communicate directly with God. You don't need this church as the intermediary. That was sort of the beginning of the end of papal power.
Absolutely. I mean, that was the thing when Stephen anointed Pepin the Short. You know, he said, anyone who no one can depose a Carolingian crown. And you did so under penalty of you face the devil, you face damnation, you face excommunication. And that was all very real then. If you think about the great cathedrals in Europe, what do you have on the outside? Get all these gargoyles and everything. That's evil. It's out there. And only inside the church is their sanctity. So you're absolutely correct. It was ruled by fear.
So you did various master's level studies here and there. What were the titles of your theses?
It was basically, the last one was Adenauer's role in the restoration of Europe after the war.
To bring the connection of government to church a little closer to home, you may be aware that Thomas Jefferson was very much anti-slavery, even though he was a slave owner. And his big problem was what's going to happen with the additional lands that he bought basically from the French. One of the things he did is he grub-staked some families out of what was to become West Virginia. It was Virginia at the time. And he sent them to Illinois, what was to become Illinois, but it was just Indian territory, and there were no European established villages there except some forts from the British. And he sent them there to establish a religion that would drive the votes to oppose slavery in that part of what was to be the U.S. They settled in, the first settlement was a New Design in the Indian Territory in the Illinois. And they established a Free Baptist church. And they built upon that, and they expanded that to, I don't know, maybe 15 or 18 locations, purely with the purpose of outvoting the pro-slavery people that were in the area. So there's been a lot of use of the churches to accomplish political objectives and government intentions. And I think that continues.
I would say one thing about that, Tom. I really think, and Elaine said, well, she asked me yesterday, how is this relevant today? And the relevance today is the churches aren't that active politically, all right? The religions is, the congregants are, but you don't see the Baptist church, the head of the Baptist church marching down the aisles. And you certainly don't see it in the Methodist church. You don't see it in the Episcopal church generally. It's really the congregants, it's religion that's driving that fervor, much more so than the organizational structure of those organizations. And that's the relevance, I think, to what today is. Thank you, Tom.
Hey, Tom,
Sir.
how did this conflict evolve to present England today, where you have the crown, and you have the church, and you have government, where the crown is basically a figurehead, although influential? So where are we today, and how did we get there?
Well, that's another whole thing. I mean, we start with John and his thing, and then you go to Henry. Henry says, I want to divorce this woman, and the Pope says you can't, so he says, fine, I'm going to take my church away from yours, and I'm going to establish the Anglican Church. I'll be the head of it. I'm going to take all of your monasteries and all your land and what have you. Okay, that works for a while. I'm not a student of that era to know just how much he was involved in the running of the church. I think it was more just that.
So the government became the ruling authority.
Well, yeah, the government was the ruling authority, and the church just happened to, I'd have to take it offline. Ed, you had something to add?
Well, I'll just say, I get my information from watching The Crown, but as recently as Queen Elizabeth and her sister Margaret wanting to marry someone
Right.
who'd been divorced, the bishops of the Church of England vetoed it, and she felt obliged to
Right.
comply with them.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's true.
I would take a deal right now that Pope Leo could have a power of excommunication over a few people in the world. Putin, the Ayatollah, our own president, Kim Jong-un, and they felt obliged to comply with what he wanted.
Right.
I'm afraid that ship has sailed, but
Yeah.
That would produce a better world today if we could do that.
It would, but I think the thing that precludes that is,
Tom, that was fascinating and very
Thank you.
illuminating, and also very discouraging to see how much religion, the church, was intertwined with violence and suppression and wealth for forever, I guess,
yes.
as I believe it certainly is now. But that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things you talk about the church being intertwined with the violence, the story of the Cathars in France, where it was an offshoot religion, and the Pope says we got to do away with them. Sent his armies, the French army up there. They went into one town, and the French lord says, "Well, who do we, how do we determine and who do we kill?" And the bishop said, "Kill them all. Let God sort it out." Literally. Well, those weren't exactly the words, but that's what he said.
Tom, yeah, I wanted to bring it up today too. The past hopefully illuminates the present. And you said like today it's religion, it's the congregants, but Franklin Graham, he more or less ordained Trump as the chosen, that God saved Trump to save America. And I was just wondering he gets a lot of his authority from religion, religious followers that follow the leads of a lot of these evangelicals like Franklin. And what would happen if he so alienated these religious leaders that in some way that they turned on him as popes and other religious leaders turned on rulers?
Well, the one thing I would say about that is Graham is not the head of a church as I know it. I might be mistaken, but he's sort of an independent evangelical. And the idea is of the church and the church structure doing things. What my take is, religion is driving this a lot from the bottom up. That, hey, we need to get, we need to end this woke controversy. We don't need these kind of people here. You're treading on my religious rights. Alito the other day made an announcement somewhere in an international council that religion is under attack everywhere. Religion, that wasn't the church. That was religion, and that's why I said.
Religious leaders among that evangelical group that are definitely.
But yeah, but the point is, those are individuals. They're influential over a portion of people. But what I was talking about was the institution of the church itself. And I don't know that there are any churches, mainline churches right now, that take that stance.
Southern Baptist. Like Southern Baptist.
Does the church? That's the point. I don't know if the church does. Southern Baptists do, yeah.
Well, I would say there are new institutions involved now. Those have to do with media. They have to do with television stations. They have to do with the television stations that had mega churches. They have to do with the financial incentive to have those great big churches. So there are individual pastors who ally themselves with those larger institutions, and it's become a media social force. And now we have AI thrown into the mix on top of everything else, so who knows where this is going, because you say it comes from the bottom down, but the members of religions are influenced by the media and by AI and by what they see online. So it's it's a different story, but it's the same story.
As this flame extinguishes itself, as we leave this space, we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of love, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet together again. Tom has some closing words for us. And if he doesn't, you can read these right here.
The thing I was going to say, I got into it, what my closing words when we finished up here. But I think the lesson for today is that the churches themselves are not active as much as they need to be. Those of you who knew Sandy McElway had a blog that he wrote, said, hey, when is the church going to step up and say, enough's enough? The problem is there's not the same structure you had in the Catholic Church. You know, you didn't have the same top-down discipline. You don't have that. We see it all the time. The Episcopal Church in Heathville, right? What happened when they went, you know, somebody said we're going to do this differently, they went that way. So it's a different environment. And I guess I would like to say I would like to see the church step up in some of these.
So as we leave this space, may we remember history is not only written in books, but lived in the choices we make each day. May we go forth with courage to question, with humility to listen, and with compassion to act. Go in peace, and may the Spirit of love guide you on your way.